It is the middle of April right now, and I figured go outside and enjoy this beautiful weather we're having. Still have snow on the ground, but it is melting away. And I figured may as well do a video on our plans. And some of these are going to be long-term plans, such as right over here. This is on the south side of our driveway. And for most of the year, this pond that you see is not there. It's just generally too dry. But with the spring melt, it's full. And at some point, we want to eventually move this fence line to the other side of where the pond is and clean up the bush and dig out the pond so that it is permanent and just basically make it a more livable area. On the north side of the driveway, we have this wet area. Every spring it fills with water, and long-term plan is to basically dig a ditch, or I guess they call it a swale these days or whatever, and make it so that it doesn't flood out quite so close to the driveway. And eventually, as part of this, we'll take out this fence line over here because it's falling apart anyways, and have a buried culvert that directs any overflow water into the ditch. The roof of this old shed collapsed a couple of winters ago just from the weight of snow. And the plan is to continue to slowly dismantle it, salvage what wood we can, and just clean it all up. There's all kinds of stuff in there. And eventually, this space in front, we're planning to build a 20-foot by 20-foot shelter, and inside of it, we will have an outdoor kitchen. And in this outer yard area, at some point, the plan is to have a number of high raised beds, because the southern exposure here is pretty awesome and much better than the main garden area right now. And so we want to build some high raised beds in here for permanent garden beds. This area here is where we finally had a huge branch pile chipped and the remaining parts cleaned up, burned away, and still need more cleanup. We've got the remains of garden soil under that black tarp over there. We need to replace our burn barrel, it's falling apart. But my daughters are planning to build a small shelter here, and it will be over a forge my daughter is planning to build. On the side of the garage here is where I've decided is probably the best place to place a shed that somebody is gifting us. Once it gets some repairs, it will be at first used as a chicken coop until we can build a more permanent mobile chicken coop that I have in mind. We have to be careful where we place it because I don't want it to shade off the beds that we have over here. They're still covered with their winter mulch. One of them is an asparagus bed in the foreground, and the other, closer to the garage, is the sunchoke bed. This chain link fence can be used as part of the chicken run, and we have to make sure, of course, the vehicle gate is open. It gets very muddy in the spring. It's been not very muddy this year, very unusual. Here we have another of our garden beds that needs to be prepped as things warm up. I'm thinking this year we'll be planting peas along the chain link fence for them to climb. For these beds, I use the old chimney blocks to create a raised bed because there's so much space under the chain link that the soil was just falling out when we tried to have a regular bed. And we've got these pipes over here to hold protective netting to keep critters out of whatever we plant here. I have not yet decided what is going to be planted here this year, but it's an ideal place for anything that climbs. Here you can see a black currant bush, I think, that my mother gifted me. It actually got eaten by deer, but it recovered. I've got a bench that was made out of scrap wood a couple years ago, and the pedestal there is actually marking the grave of a couple of cats that passed away in the last couple of years. In this space over here, we have 3 haskap bushes. 2 of them have been here for like 3 years. these two larger ones. This one over here has been there for 2 years, and they're not doing very well. We have yet to have a crop out of them. I think part of the problem is, well, we've got the lilac over here, and then we have this very large Chinese elm over here, and I think we do need to move them. However, the other problem is that this bed has a lot of perennial flowers growing in it. And last year they were absolutely massive and completely covered the bushes, so I just think they don't have a chance in this location. Hopefully I'll be able to transplant them into a better spot. This is a spot that a couple of years back we had grow bags of potatoes, and when we harvested the potatoes, I just dumped the soil to make another bed. Last year we tried growing white strawberries in here. They completely failed. So I'm thinking this year I might actually plant some breadseed poppies and treat it as a perennial poppy bed, as they will reseed themselves. I haven't quite 100% decided. Part of the problem is that this fence gets completely covered by this vine, and of course that shades out everything. If I can keep the vine under control, then I should be able to grow something here. This spot here is where last year we had the Aunt Molly's ground cherry growing, and we're just going to test and see if they will seed themselves and come back on their own this year. The compost pile is a real mess right now because the deer kept going into it over the winter and spreading stuff around. We have this bed over here. It's getting warm enough that we can prep this bed for planting. And the fence posts, they were used to weigh down netting we had over this bed before. Last year we had a combination of corn and beans growing in here. I have not quite decided what I want to plant in here this year. This bed is already prepped. I'm going to be planting Tom Thumb corn in this one. They only grow to about 2 feet high. And while things are still well before our last frost date, we'll be able to plant carrots in this one. Thinking about the work that's going to need to be done this summer. This area over here, there's a lot of deadfall, a lot of dead trees stuck on other trees, a lot of dead trees that haven't fallen yet, and it's basically a big mess that needs to be cleaned up. A lot of dead trees that need to be taken down, and if the wood is not rotten yet, they will be used to build our outdoor kitchen shelter and any other things that we can salvage the wood for. There's an apple tree over here that we uncovered, and it's actually doing pretty good, so we're keeping that one. But a lot of this poplar, it's kind of taking over, so we'll be thinning that out and use it for things, see what spruces we can save. And after the dead stuff is all cleaned out, I want to start planting more spruces in here because they're really good for sheltering, especially with the wind. We get a lot of wind out here. Here we have what I call our old kitchen garden. The wattle weave bed I finished last fall. We'll be able to plant in it this spring. This rectangular bed over here, I need to get out the mint roots that are trying to completely take over and raise it up a little bit higher, again to try and keep the mint from taking over. This whole area here in the summer gets completely filled with mint. You can see the little pieces of plastic blowing around. We had a new roof put in on the fall, and that's from the new shingles. Believe it or not, I actually picked up a lot of them, so these have just blown in from this morning. We've got some bulbs planted along here, our path over here. This new bed, I'm planning to plant shallots in it, and I'll just step in front. I planted some bulbils from Egyptian walking onion right in front of the new bed. And these blocks, creating a retaining wall. Some of them have chives in them, and the others have alternating blocks with the mint that I transplanted so I can keep them. There's a slightly raised bed over here. It's storing other stuff right now. Clean that up, and I actually want to raise it a little bit higher as well because it also got absolutely taken over by invasive plants that are growing in this garden. Try and get the roots out, clean it up, raise it up. and get that taken care of. Got the wattle leaf bed over here, and these are left over from the branch pile that got chipped. This is stuff that was too big to be chipped, but also was not very rotten, so I'm salvaging them, and we'll be able to use them to make these other beds higher. This area that we have fenced off to keep the deer out, we have my daughter's planted a whole bunch of different tulips in here, and so far they're not going to come up. It's just too early in the season, but I'm hoping to, finally actually get tulips that make it to bloom and not get eaten by deer. This space in here is where we planted a couple hundred grape hyacinths or muscari. In between here and here, these rows of trees. And then we have a little section by that stump. That's where wild strawberries are. So hopefully we'll be seeing muscari starting to come up here soon. And then in this section here, along here, we've planted 4 or 5 different types of snow crocuses, which again, nothing is growing yet, but hopefully soon. So here we have in our other half of the maple grove, this area had one of the branch piles that got chipped, nice and clear. I intend to plant seeds for an alternative lawn mix in there, and get a lot of purple bellflower growing in here. It's very invasive. There was another branch pile over here that got cleaned up. I had been considering this location right here to build a small garden shed, but there's a lot of tree stumps and roots and stuff like that. I considered for a moment planting it where this other branch pile was, where things are nice and clear, and I just about tripped over that. But I will probably continue to plant the alternative lawn mix seeds in here instead, because I think this spot here will be the best one to build the new garden shed, right next to the junk pile that we need to clean up and the old garden shed that is rotting and falling apart. And those logs over there are also stuff that could not be chipped, but are actually salvageable to use for something. So we'll figure that out. A couple of old tillers that don't work. One of the reasons I want to have the garden shed closer to here is this tap, which doesn't work right now. We'll need to get rid of that tree stump, which is still sending up shoots, an old elm. We need to dig. It's basically a hose running through here, and I'll just sort of follow along. You can kind of see why it's going to be a challenge digging through here, because these large trees, and there's going to be some large roots that we're going to have to dig through. This is actually another tree stump that I've covered with tires, and another tree stump. And then finally, as we get over to, this is our septic tank that's covered with the insulated tarp, and then our tap over here, and there is the end of a hose coming out of the ground to screw into that tap, and that's where the water to the garden tap comes from. So that's all the area that we're going to need to dig a trench from here all the way across to there. Let's see if I can zoom in. And that's where the tap is. This path that I'm standing on right now used to be the path that was on the very edge of the garden, and that tap was just, right at the garden path. Trees were planted in front of it. The garden area got made smaller. There used to be more trees. A lot of them died because they were planted too close together. I'm kind of hoping this one lonely Colorado blue spruce will survive, but because of how close these trees were planted to the house, one of the problems is that it shades this area a lot. This used to be part of the main garden, and I'm hoping that as we build, more high raised beds, that'll solve some of the problem. So far this is where we had a squash patch last year, and it flooded, and it was just a terrible growing year altogether. And I'm hoping to plant squash here again and not have flooding, but we'll see how it works. Over time, we'll have high raised beds like that log one over there, all along here, and fill all this in with high raised beds. And the raised beds will be designed with accessibility and mobility in mind. So that whole age in place thing. And oh, there's our garlic bed. That's the only thing that's planted in here right now. And beside it, that tarp is covering some sifted soil that we'll be able to put back into beds as we prep them once things are in a position that we can actually start planting again, which might be, I don't know, another month. Last year in this area where the straw is, we had potatoes on one side and melons on the other, and it all flooded out, so it did not do well at all. We actually harvested fewer potatoes than we planted. So for this year, the plan is we will be building permanent trellis tunnels with raised beds on either side of the tunnel so that we can plant our climbing plants, our melons, our beans and whatnot in here, and have maybe not a high raised bed like this, but at least half that height, so that if we do get flooding again, things have a chance of actually surviving. And over there with posts around it, that is where we had corn and the Hullis seed pumpkins and some other squash in here. Here we have a row of crabapple trees. There were more of them. A number of them have died. This one over here is dead and needs to be removed. Some others, they are diseased, and we will need to cut them down. Of the remaining trees, there's just 2 of them that actually have edible crab apples, and so I want to cut down the other ones to try and save the 2 good ones and start planting other types of apples. We have an apple variety that will be arriving this spring. I'm not quite sure where we're going to plant it, but it needs to be planted where it can be pollinated by some other variety. So this one here is one of the ones that has edible apples. They're very small, but they're good for making hard apple cider or apple cider vinegar. So this needs to be taken out. These 2, I think this one as well is diseased. And then this one over here needs to be taken out. And I'm not sure. Part of it is edible, part of it isn't. The original tree died and it's just the suckers that are there now. Hey, here's the low area for this spot, and this is the wood chip pile from getting all those branch piles chipped. We still have more branch piles that need to be done, but I was able to use quite a lot of the pile, much of it going into here, which is where we have planted the silver buffalo berry. Last year after we planted them, we had flooding, and the ones at this end were completely underwater, but they survived. They actually did quite well. So we've got silver buffalo berry all along here in 2 rows, and they will eventually form a privacy shelter. They're nitrogen fixers, so they will help with that. We'll have other fruit and berry trees planted along here. The last 2 at the end here are high bush cranberry. Just try to not step on any trees here. The one in here got eaten a couple of times by deer, so it got protected by the sawhorse. Here we have, I don't know if you can hear over this wind, we planted 5 sea buckthorn. Only 2 of them survived. I've got this rigged up post and buck fence just to make sure the deer didn't eat it. And at some point we will get more sea buckthorn to make sure that we have enough to actually, produce berries, since they need both a male and female plant. This is where we used to have our pea trellises and beans and stuff like that. So this area is now basically prepped that we will be planting more trees. Different, for our food forest is going to be over here. We had a squash patch over here, some hullis seed pumpkins, 5 of them in here. We might use this patch again just because it's, good soil, because we did amend the soil quite well. But it would be a temporary bed. And here is our temporary squash tunnel that last year we actually had beans, some gourds and stuff like that growing in it. And this is going to come down so that we can salvage the wire to use on the new permanent squash tunnel we'll be building. And if things go to plan, we'll actually have 2 or 3 permanent squash tunnels or tunnel trellises. And eventually we'll also be building, here we got more of the garden, and this is just open. There's a telephone line buried under here, so we have to make sure this is kept clear. I'd like to get rid of this row of trees. They were not planted there deliberately. But yeah, hopefully we'll have at least 3 trellis tunnels, and then we'll have temporary trellises that we can move wherever we need, depending on what we're planting in different areas. And yeah, that's our garden plans and other long-term plans that we have. And we'll see how much of it we actually manage to do this year. In here, this is our large aquarium greenhouse that we made with aquarium lights to protect and keep new seedlings warm. This one we've got spoon tomatoes, 2 rows of them that are doing very well. And then the rest are different varieties of peppers that are finally coming up. And on this side, over the warming mat, we have Roma VF tomatoes. And they're going to need to be potted up soon. And you can just barely see spearmint and oregano. There actually are finally some itty bitty seedlings starting. We have a small aquarium greenhouse as well. Got strawberries in that tray over there, and we have classic eggplant. They were planted late because the seeds were stored in the wrong bin, but we do finally have 1 germinating. Hopefully we'll have more soon. Here we have 2 varieties of red onion, 1 of yellow onions, and 1 variety of shallots. And over here we have some newly potted up indigo blue tomatoes, indigo blue chocolate. Over here we have a few black beauty tomatoes that were potted up, and we have some what are these, Caveman Club gourd. That pot got reseeded and nothing's coming up. And these are our few little finger eggplant seedlings that have come up. These empty cells got replanted, and some were replanted in there. There's only one that's coming up next to the one that came up before. They're not doing very well. It's really hard to get proper light here. Down here, that is some thyme that's going to be like a houseplant. And here are more of the black beauty. Hang on. Yes, black beauty tomatoes in here. And then more black beauty tomatoes. Our 1 single loofah that has germinated. Try to focus on there. And here we have some peppers. I can't remember the name of them right now. I thought I had it written down. One of them's labeled somewhere. Some more thyme, those will be going outside. And some lemongrass, they will be going into a pot outside because they need a special microclimate to grow. Over here, this tall, lanky vine is a zucca melon. We have 2 of them that actually germinated out of the ones that we planted. And we did replant other pots. So far, nothing's coming out of there. And then we have African drum gourd, again, of the ones we planted, 2 germinated, and we replanted and none have come out. There's 1 pot I ended up putting pawpaw seeds in. We'll see what happens there. And then these 4 that are actually doing very well are Crespo squash. And hopefully we'll actually be able to have them survive long enough to produce, because the last couple of years they got killed off. And yeah, it's just been not much luck growing things in the last couple of years. And over here is our scale model of the outdoor kitchen shelter that we're planning to build.